So when I was 14 years old, I got my first ever summer job. And I hesitate to use the word job because I didn't get paid for it. It was an internship at a summer camp, much like the summer camp that I met Hannah at. But this was the day camp version for kids 8 through 12. It was a theater camp. We taught kids basic theater skills, and it was also through a Christian organization, so we did some devotional times, we did some worship times, we played some games. It was basically like YMCA, but replace the sports with theater, if you will. And I was 14, so I was an intern. I was unpaid. I basically was a gopher, doing whatever the counselors and the teachers needed me to do. But then the next summer, I came back and I was hired as an illegal worker. And the reason that I use the term illegal is because technically at these camps you're not allowed to be on hired staff until you're 16 years old, and I was only 15 that summer. But what you have to understand is when I was 15, I was 6'2", 210 pounds, and I had looked like I was 18 since I was about 12. So I just fooled everybody, and I snuck in as an illegal paid 15-year-old worker. And I was hired as what they call an extra teacher. Now, to understand what an extra teacher is, you have to understand camp structure. Generally, at camp, there are 3 teams. There's a red team, a blue team, and a green team. And those 3 teams are led by 3 different counselors who are also teachers. And they teach the 3 basic things that are involved in theater. There's an acting teacher, a singing teacher, and a dance teacher. But as camp got more popular, they got too many kids signing up. And whenever you got a team that was more than 30, you had to break off and create a 4th team. This 4th team was the orange team. And that's a really rough color. And I'll tell you why. It's because if you are the leader of the orange team and you're trying to get your little 8-year-olds to cheer during games time and get a team cheer going, nothing rhymes with orange. So what we did was we created our cheer that goes, orange team, nothing rhymes with orange. And that got them fired up for at least a little bit. I don't think they realized how funny it was, but I did. But that created a problem because now there are 4 teachers in 4 different classes, but acting, singing, and dancing are already covered. And so I was very confused at what I was supposed to teach. And I had never taught anything or led anything before in my life. And nowadays, if you work for this camp and this organization, they have an entire packet filled with lessons and curriculum that you can teach these kids. But when I showed up, I said, what am I teaching? And they said, you get to choose. And I was like, okay, great. So I'm standing there in front of 30 plus 8 to 12-year-olds, and I've never taught anything, I've never led anything, and you would think that I would choose something like arts and crafts, or we'd play games, or I would choose something that I had some experience in, like I'd done a lot of improv theater, or maybe I'd teach them to play basketball or something. That was a sport I knew how to play. But I didn't choose any of that. What I chose was we're going to do Bible study. And now that might make sense to you right now, knowing what you know about me, knowing that part of what I do is I make videos surrounding the Bible or even teaching directly from the Bible. But you have to understand, when I was an illegal 15-year-old worker, I had never opened up a Bible voluntarily in my life. I knew nothing about the Bible. My biblical knowledge was 0. And yet I was like, yeah, I'll just teach these kids the Bible. It's not too late to start. Side note, it's never too late. That's the title of my talk tonight. We're going to get back to that. Hop back in. So I chose Bible study. And at that point in my life, the only thing that I knew, the only story I was familiar with from the Bible was the story of Father Abraham. And the only reason I knew that was because of the song. Father Abraham and many sons. Sing it with me. And many sons. Father Abraham. Oh, yeah. You guys are good. Side note, I actually had a friend who took my name and put it in the song and replaced sons with wives. I'm not sure why he was singing Jon Jorgenson had many wives. It's not true. Anyway. And so for old time's sake tonight, I thought, if you don't mind, I would love to teach you all the lesson the first ever Bible study lesson that I taught. Would you mind, just for old time's sake? Great. So the story of Abraham is actually found in the book of Genesis. I didn't know that when I was an illegal 15-year-old worker. I actually had to Google it. And I found it is in Genesis, and it begins in chapter 12. And starts Genesis 12, verses 1 through 5. The Lord had said to Abram, side note, Abram is actually Abraham. I didn't know that either when I started. God changed his name later on. Very important if you're going to be teaching this story. The Lord had said to Abram, who is Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram, who is Abraham, went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, who becomes Sarah. God's changing names all over the place. His nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. And when I read that story back as an illegal 15-year-old worker, and the hundreds of times I've read it since, I've always been amazed at Abraham's faith. Because this wasn't some simple request that God was giving him. I don't think we necessarily understand. Because Abraham, at that time in his life, he was an established man. He'd been living in this territory of Haran for a long time. He had a family there. He had his wife and his nephew. He didn't have any kids yet, but he had his wife and his nephew. He had possessions. He had servants. And God was asking him basically to pick up his entire life and go. And not only that, but God didn't even tell him where he was going. God said, go to the land that I will show you. God's not like, you're going to move to Miami. God said, just get your stuff, get in the moving van and start driving, and then I'm going to show you. And then, to add even more to that, it's not like he was moving down the street. He wasn't moving like from Dubuque to Des Moines. He was moving, we later find out, from Haran to Canaan. And this is a journey of over 1,000 miles on foot. But when God shows up and calls Abraham and tells him to do this, Abraham doesn't question it. He doesn't say, no, but. He doesn't say, give me a couple days. He doesn't make any excuses. He gets up and he goes. And that is amazing faith. And that was my lesson as a 15-year-old illegal worker who had never studied the Bible before. To these kids, it was, have faith like Abraham. When God calls you to do something, get up and do it. And as I've grown older, I've realized that that's really easy to say, but it's not so easy to do. I think a lot of times we want to be faithful like Abraham, and we want to answer God's call. But if we're honest, most of the time, we're more like Moses. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses is at the burning bush. Many of you are familiar with this story. I wasn't. And at the burning bush, Moses, he notices this bush that's burning up, but it's on fire, but it's not really on fire. And then all of a sudden, God speaks to him through the bush. And God says this. God says in verse 10, he says, so now go. Sound familiar? I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And then one thing you got to understand is the Israelites at this time in history, they had been slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. And at this point, God is calling Moses and saying, you're going to be the leader to set them free. And Moses' response is this in verse 11. He says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I remember when I first felt this call from God, or when I first felt this passion or this desire to write or to make videos, or to go to schools and churches and speak about him. It was about 18 months ago, and I remember specifically because that night I wrote something down in my journal. I don't call it a diary because I'm not a girl. I call it a journal. It's very masculine. I wrote this. I wrote, God, if you give me the platform, I will use it. And since then, in the past 18 months, I've published 2 books. I write on a blog that I write on 3 times a week. I make weekly videos trying to encourage others, and I go to universities and churches all around the country and I talk to people. Since that call 18 months ago, I've tried to answer that call every single day. But it wasn't always like that. And if I'm honest with you, the first time I really heard that call from God, the first time I really discovered my passion for writing and speaking was almost 10 years ago. But for 10 years, I struggled with that same question that Moses struggles with. That question, who am I? Who am I to try and do this? Who am I to write? Who am I to speak? Who am I to try and make a difference? And anyone in here who has ever had a passion, anyone in here who has ever felt God calling them to do something, has felt and asked themselves that question. We think things like, surely God doesn't mean me. He means someone else. We think, I'm nobody. I'm not good enough. We begin to make excuses. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not fast enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not pretty enough. No one's going to want to read what I write. No one's going to want to listen to what I say. I'm just going to look stupid. And have you ever noticed that the moment we hear God's call is the same moment we come up with a million reasons why we can't fulfill it? And I'm going to say that again for those of you who are taking notes, because that's a really good point. The moment we hear God's call is the same moment we come up with a million reasons why we can't fulfill it. It's the moment that self-doubt creeps in, and we begin to ask this question, who am I to do that? And whenever I think of that question, who am I always remember that really famous Marianne Williamson quote. And in it, she asks that question. She says, we ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Who am I to be used by God? Who am I to try and inspire others? Who am I to try and make a difference? And her answer, her follow-up to this question is beautiful. She says this, she says, actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. And so, one thing I want to encourage you all on tonight is the next time you're thinking about your passion, or the next time you're thinking about starting something, or the next time you feel that God's calling you to do something, and that voice creeps in that says, who am I to try and do that? And you begin to ask yourself that question, and that self-doubt creeps in. The only answer that you should be giving to that question of who am I is I am a child of God. You see, we want to be faithful like Abraham and answer God's call, but if we're honest, most of the time we're a lot more like Peter. In Matthew, the Gospel, chapter 26, Jesus is with his disciples at what we call the Last Supper. And at this supper, Jesus is speaking with his disciples, and he's letting them know that, and he warns them that he's about to be betrayed. And he is about to be handed over, and he's about to be crucified. And he tells his disciples that all of them are going to abandon him. And Peter, in his regular Peter fashion, he stands up, and in front of everyone, he makes an oath. He swears, he screams it, he yells it, he says, even if all fall away, I never will. He makes a strong promise, and he stands up and he makes an oath. But we all know what happens. In less than 24 hours, Peter finds himself sitting in the courtyard and he has denied Jesus 3 times. Growing up, I had my fair share of struggles, like I'm sure many of you had. I had a really bad temper as a kid. I struggled with anger a lot. You can ask my mother. I'm not sure how you're going to get in contact with her, but you can ask her because she had to deal with my temper tantrums all the time. And as I got older, I struggled with lying a lot. What teenager doesn't? I lied to my parents and to my friends. I struggled a lot with pride and arrogance. And then probably my biggest struggle was with lust and purity. And every single time I would find myself falling to a temptation in this area, I would stand up and I would make this oath. I would make these promises like Peter. I would say, God, I'm never going to do that again. God, I'm never going to go on that website again. God, I'm never going to hang out with that person again. God, I'm going to be so faithful to you. I promise I'm going to go 6 months, a year, 2 years, and I'm never going to screw up again. I promise you. And then just like Peter, within the course of a day, 2 days, or a week, I would be right back where I started. And I began to understand so clearly what Paul talks about in his letter to the Romans when he says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I do, I hate. Have you ever made a big promise, whether it was to a friend, a parent, or to God, and you say, I promise I'm going to do this. This is what I'm going to do. I will answer your call, God. I'm never going to hurt you again. I'm never going to do that again. And you stand and you make this oath. But then the next day, you find yourself right back in the same position. And I want to remind you tonight that big promises and grand statements do not transform a heart. The only thing that can transform a heart is an encounter with the grace of God. And I'm going to say that again just in case you're taking notes. Big promises and grand oaths do not transform a heart. That's why Jesus said, do not swear on anything, but just let your yes be yes and your no be no, because Jesus knows that grand statements don't change your heart. It is only through an encounter with His grace that our hearts can change. And until you encounter that grace, whether it's for the first time or for the 100th time, you will always find yourself in a cycle of making a big promise and breaking the promise. Making a promise and breaking the promise. And rinse and repeat. And rinse and repeat. We want to be faithful like Abraham and answer God's call. But most of the time, if we're really honest, we're just like Jonah. Many of you are familiar with the story of Jonah, if only because of VeggieTales. And since most of us are familiar, I only want to read the first couple verses from Jonah chapter 1. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Back in high school, I was part of the drama club. And I was lucky enough to get some of the lead roles in musicals and plays and whatnot. And because of that, a lot of my peers looked up to me as sort of a leader in that community. And because of that, my teachers and my directors and my friends, they were always encouraging me to run for drama club president. Whenever elections would come up for drama club officers, they'd like, John, you should run, you're already a leader anyway, you should become an official leader. You should really take that position of leadership. And we would sit in meetings every time there were elections, and every year, I would be nominated once, twice, 3 times. And every time someone would say, I nominate John, they would ask, John, do you accept that nomination? And my answer was no. Every single time. I avoided leadership at all costs. Not just in the drama club, all throughout my schooling years. I was told by my teachers, you're such a natural leader. People want to follow you. And I avoided it at all costs. I was being called to lead, and I ran in the complete other direction because I didn't want the responsibility and because I was terrified that I was going to fail. And I thought if I ran in the other direction, if I just stayed away from leadership altogether, then I would eliminate the possibility of failure. And that's true. If you run away from your calling, you will eliminate the possibility of failing. But by running away and avoiding the possibility of failure, you also eliminate any opportunity for success. If you avoid the possibility of letting others down, then you will never be given an opportunity to lift others up. You see, sometimes there's no question of what God is calling us to do. Sometimes there's no question of what our passion is. Sometimes it's being thrown at us like, John, you are a leader, you are a leader, you are a leader. But for whatever reason, we run the other direction. We know what we're passionate about. We know that we should reach out to that person who lives across the hall from us. We know that we should start a small group. We know we want to audition or serve on the worship team. But for some reason, because we're afraid to fail, we run the other way. We want to be faithful like Abraham and answer God's call. But if we're really honest with ourselves, most of the time, we're like Moses. And we ask that question, who am I? We doubt ourselves. Most of the time, we're like Peter. And we make these bold statements, and we stick to none of them. Most of the time, we're like Jonah, and we just run the complete opposite direction because we're so afraid. And perhaps right now you're thinking, I thought you came here, John, to inspire us and motivate us. This is super depressing. Well, it's about to get real hopeful. Are you tracking with me? Cool. Because, does anyone remember how the story of Moses ends? You see, even through all of his self-doubt, even through him saying, who am I, who am I, who am I? God still used him to set the Israelites free. Does anyone recall how the story of Peter ends? Even though he made a promise and broke a promise, made a promise and broke a promise, time and time and time again, God still used him as one of the greatest apostles and church planters that the world has ever known. Do you remember how the story of Jonah ends? That even though he tried his best to run the complete opposite direction, God still found a way, even if he had to get him through a whale, to take him to Nineveh and to have one of the most evil cities that the world has ever known repent on the spot and turn to God. And do you know how my story ends? I'm not sure yet. I'm still in the middle of it. But I know that part of it is me answering God's call to speak. And for me to show up here tonight and to remind you of one thing. Because I know what you're thinking. Because I've thought it myself. You're thinking, you don't know, John, I've wasted so much time. I have doubted myself every day of my life. I have broken so many promises to God and to others. I've run away so many times. It must be too late for me. But, and it's about to get even more hopeful for you, something I didn't realize at first when I was teaching that story of Abram, who is Abraham, to those children when I was a 15-year-old illegal. Does anyone recall how old the scripture says Abraham was when he left? Who? How old was he? 75 years old. He was no spring chicken. Even in biblical times. And so if you are sitting here right now and you're trying to give me this excuse that it's too late for you, I want you to turn to Genesis 12 and look at where it says Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He was 75 years old when he heard God's call and he answered it. And if it wasn't too late for Abraham at 75 years old, then I don't want to hear you say it's too late for you at 19 or 20 or 21. And I'll give you an even closer example. For 20 or so years, I ignored God's call in my life. I spent 20 years, like Moses, doubting myself, saying, who am I to do this? Who am I to do this? Who am I to try? I spent 20 years, like Peter, making these promises and breaking these promises, making them and breaking them. I spent 20 years, like Jonah, completely running away from leadership or writing or using my gifts for God's glory. I spent 20 years being unfaithful to God's call. But I don't know about you, but I plan to live to be about 120 or so. Maybe 100. And I don't know about you, but I am not going to let 20 years of unfaithfulness ruin the opportunity for 80 years of faithfulness. I'm not going to let 20 years of doubting myself keep me from answering God's call and doing 80 years of bringing people into freedom. I'm not going to let 20 years of breaking promises keep me from 80 years of keeping promises. I'm not going to let 20 years of running away from God keep me from 80 years of running and eventually limping and using a walker towards Him. Because it's not too late for me and it's not too late for you. And I believe that is why God has brought me here tonight, is to let you know that it's not too late for you, and it's not too late for that thing that's been on your heart. And it's going to be different for everyone in this room, and some of you might not even know exactly what it is yet. But that thing you've wanted to start, that relationship you've wanted to mend, whatever it is, I'm here to tell you that it's not too late. It is never too late, because His mercies are new every morning. And His word says that in Him we are a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come. It's not too late for God to use me. And it'll never be too late for God to use you.